Hi, this is Chris Kallal, Technical Agronomist for DeKalb Agro in West Central Illinois. It is Friday, August the 7th, and I was going to share with you an agronomic update on things I've been seeing in the field. Just going to hit on a few things, just overall give a pest update, talk a little bit about disease, insects, and weeds, an overall crop update, and then finish up with a GDU update and some estimates as we get ready to look into the fall. In almost every field I get into, I can find all four of these diseases in the field. The first one I'll start with there on the left is physoderma. This disease essentially looks like you took a black Sharpie and made a bunch of dots on the leaf sheath, on the midrib of the leaf, and on the stalk. Physoderma is something that we've definitely been paying more attention to the last couple years as it's becoming more prevalent in fields. It is favored by warm, wet conditions, and the infection does happen earlier on in the season. In the middle there, you see a picture of gray leaf spot. This is probably the worst infection I'd seen in any field I'd been in. This was actually from Pike County. But you can find gray leaf in every single cornfield right now. I would say we went into pollination pretty clean, just like we did in 2018. There was a lot of nervousness and fear with the environment that we had that we may have an explosion of gray leaf after pollination. And luckily, we just really haven't seen that. Yes, the disease has progressed up through the canopy. But so far, I would say the gray leaf infections are far less than what I anticipated them to be with the environment we've had. There on the bottom right, you see a picture of southern rust. This is a disease that's currently prevalent across the entire state of Illinois right now. It does sound like it is more severe to the north and the south. Right here in the I-72 corridor, I would say the infection is really in its infancy stages. It can be identified in almost every single field, and I think within the coming weeks we will see this disease become more prevalent and more severe and more noticeable in cornfields. Southern rust is more of a tropical disease favored by warm, wet conditions. It does not overwinter here in Illinois. It overwinters in the south, and it does come north in storms that we have during the summer months. It can be pretty detrimental to yield as those spores cause a lot of water loss out of the plant. Keep an eye out on later planted corn. There in the top picture you see some corn smut. This is something I get asked about occasionally. It's rarely yield limiting for us, doesn't really cause much of a problem. It's just kind of odd to look at and see. Generally it happens through a wound in the plant. The fungus infects the plant through a wound of insects or hail or something like that. The interesting fact about it is these galls are actually a delicacy in parts of the world. In regards to diseases in soybeans, probably the most common one you can find right now is frog eye leaf spot. This picture there on the left. It's easily identified by kind of the brownish lesions that show up on leaves with that darkened border around them. This is something that I think most of us historically kind of considered more of a southern Illinois disease that impacted more of the Group 4 type soybeans, but it has continued to move north over the past several years. Generally a disease that I would say is not a huge yield limiting factor. The lesions are pretty small, and we've got pretty good tolerances in most of our soybeans, but it is a disease that is becoming far more prevalent. We need to keep an eye on it. On the right there, you see a picture of sudden death syndrome. As I walk soybean fields, it isn't terribly hard to find a random plant here and there that is infected with sudden death. I do believe this is something we will likely see more of in the coming weeks. If you think back to the spring, a lot of soybean plants sat in the ground for a long time. They were slow to emerge. Most seed treatments last generally, give or take, 30 days. So a lot of our seed treatments ran out, and we lost protection, and we still had young soybean plants sitting in cool, wet soils, which does help drive that infection of sudden death. Here are a couple diseases I wanted to call out that we may need to be paying attention to between now and harvest. On the left there you see anthracnose top dieback. Essentially what that is that if you look at the top portion of the plant, we're starting to turn brown. So you end up with brown at the top of the plant near the tassel, you end up with brown at the bottom, and you got green in the middle. And that is anthracnose top dieback. There's three different versions of anthracnose. There's the leaf blight that affects plants early on, the stalk rot, and then top dieback. In the middle there, you see crown rot. This is something that I'm a little afraid we could see a considerable amount of this year. One of the easiest ways to identify it early on is when you got a lot of green plants left out there and you find that occasional ghosted plant like you see there in that middle picture. which essentially what that is, that plant is dead from top to bottom. High level of certainty that is because of crown rot. This is another disease that the infection happens early on in the corn's life cycle, and as cool and as wet as we were a lot this spring, with slow growth, seed treatments running out, and we're losing that protection for as long as that corn had to grow, that I think we've got a considerable amount of that infection that happens earlier this year, and we will see this continue to develop as we go forward into the fall. Might be something we want to keep an eye on, as we may need to adjust harvest schedules to stay ahead of it. On the right there, you see physoderma. I mentioned it a while ago, but one of the other things that this disease does is that it girdles the stalk at a node. Historically, this is an element of the disease that we really haven't paid a whole lot of attention to locally. It's been more of an issue to the north. But last year I started to notice this a lot, and especially when I was walking cornfields, and I would be walking across the row and separating the corn to step through the row, and if those plants broke off, it was likely physoderma causing that. So again, just another disease we want to be watching as we go forward, because as it does girdle that plant at the node, it does make it more susceptible to snap. And so again, we may need to be watching harvest schedules to stay ahead of that one as well. Just a couple quick comments around weed control. Probably one of the most prevalent weeds we can find in soybean fields out there today is volunteer corn. And if you've got soybean fields that look like that today, I would caution you to think about or be paying attention to the volunteer corn that's in that field, and what corn trait you may choose to plant in that field in 2021. And the reason I say that is that volunteer corn does give a food source for any eggs that may have hatched into that field this year, so that can increase the survival. The other thing is that the silks in those fields often are a very good bait crop for corn rootworm adult, and then you end up having those adults lay eggs in those soybean fields, which then of course leads to the potential for increased pressure on your first year corn crop. Outside of that, just general weed control comments. The level of satisfaction varies from person to person. Some people very happy with their weed control this year, some people not so much. I think a lot of it had to do with, did you get a timely rain after application so that your residuals were activated or not? One of the things I do know that we will start to see some weeds start to poke through in some soybean fields here in the coming weeks, so be expecting that. In regards to insects, not a whole lot to talk about locally. There were some Japanese beetles around, but overall I would say the level of feeding has not been terribly severe. In regards to corn rootworm, it is trapping season, so we do have some traps out now to kind of be staying abreast of what's going on in soybean fields and cornfields. What I would say around corn rootworm is that it doesn't look like in soybean fields that we're catching a lot of corn rootworm adults right now. So that leads me to believe that first year corn next year may not have a lot of pressure. But we are seeing some increased levels of feeding on some corn fields. The picture there, the bottom right, is actually from quite a ways north of us, but we do have a couple fields locally that would resemble roots that look like these, and this is corn fields with a higher level of feeding from corn rootworm than what we would like to see. So I would encourage you to keep an eye on some of your corn fields. Look for adults. If you find a lot of adults, let's be digging roots. And just take note as we think about preparing for 2021 and what decisions we make for those fields. Now for just an update on the crop in general. In regards to soybeans, I've been in fields that heavily potted, look really great, a lot of optimism, and then I've been in some fields that got quite a ways yet to go. Just a reminder that as you look at that soybean plant, 75-ish% of the yield in soybeans is going to come from the middle third. And when you look at the top portion of the plant, it's always nice to see some new flowers up there and an extra little cluster of pods in the top. That's where some of that bonus yield comes from. But with the middle part of the plant driving the vast majority of the yield, that's where I would tell you to focus your concentration in regards to looking at pods. A lot of plants out there with multiple pods hanging on every node, so I feel pretty optimistic about soybeans at this point. In regards to corn, overall stands are decent, I would say. I do think that is going to be one of our limiting factors in yield this fall. We had some spotty stand establishment this spring because of some of the rains. We had some replant. So I do think ear count is going to be a limiting factor as we think about this year's yield potential. In regards to corn, I'm getting some questions in regards to the amount of tip back or kernel abortion that may be on some ears. In some fields I've been in, it's almost non-existent. In some fields I've been in, there's a good 2.5 inches of cob showing at the top. What I encourage you to do is just to take kernel counts. This particular ear here, you know, it looks like we missed out on a lot, but that ear actually was 22 by 29. I admit it's pretty easy to get disheartened when you look at an ear like that and the amount of tip back that's showing. But when you do the math on an ear that's 22 around by 29 long, when you've got 34,000 of them per acre, that still works out to a pretty good yield number. You know, the majority of the ears I look at are 16, 18 round by 30, 32, 34 long. And that's pretty typical from what we've seen the last couple of years. You know, I think ear count obviously is going to come into play, but really what we've got to determine here going forward is the kernel size and kernel depth, and how many kernels does it take to make a bushel of corn. And these cool temperatures we've had here the last couple of days definitely helping grain fill, and we would easily welcome more of those. One other thing I'd like to call out is green snap. A couple weeks ago there in July, for 2 weeks straight there, we had some pretty good storms that went through. There is some green snap out there in a lot of fields. Sometimes just driving down the road, you wouldn't know it. I would encourage you to try to get a bird's eye view on some fields. I know there is some green snap out there that guys won't find until the combine, but I would encourage you to try to figure out how to get a bird's eye view on those fields, and let's try to get those fields walked and addressed prior to the combine getting there. Okay, so a GDU update. This is always kind of a fun conversation to have right now, but as I look at the year 2020, I would say right now we're tracking on about average. But we did start out the year a little bit below average, obviously with the cooler temperatures we had throughout May, but we have since kind of caught up, and we're really kind of tracking almost on pace with the long-term average across the central Illinois. So what I've got here is a couple tables just to kind of give a forward-looking statement. This is dangerous to do this time of year, but I'll just walk through an example. So if I look at the Mount Sterling column there on the right, so I've got a 110-day hybrid on top, 114-day hybrid on the bottom. So what I've got here in these in these charts, so different planting dates, the GDUs needed for the respective hybrids. You will notice I did shorten up the GDUs needed to reach maturity for the May 28th planting date based on data out of Bob Nielsen at Purdue. The third column you see there is an estimated blackware date based on current GDU accumulations and projections going forward. And then in the far right, you see an even scarier stab in the dark at trying to estimate when we might achieve 20% moisture grain. And as I said, this is based on long-term averages and textbook. Things will play out drastically different than this, I can guarantee. You know, if I'm within 3 to 5 days of when this actually happens, I'm going to be pretty happy. But as you look at those estimated blackware dates, I think that aligns with kind of fairly typical what we would expect for those different planting dates. It could happen a little bit faster than that, as I said. When you look at the estimated 20% grain, you know, there's a lot of times in the fall you can easily knock out a point of moisture a day. But these numbers would suggest, you know, you're running somewhere maybe around a half a point a day or so. So they could easily happen faster than that or slower than that. You know, last year I did this and I talked a lot about that late planted May corn and into June corn would never reach bend dry moisture levels. But with the above average temperatures we had in the month of October last year, a lot of that late planted corn did actually reach 20% or even sub 20% grain levels. So it's all going to vary. It all depends upon the weather we've got going forward. And like I said, this is just kind of a stab in the dark and just to kind of somewhat set some expectations of what the fall could look like if we are normal going forward. Well, that's it for today. I appreciate you taking the time to listen. Hopefully it was worthwhile and you learned something out of it. If you do want to talk more in depth about anything you heard today in this or any other questions you've got, feel free to reach out to me. As always, stay safe. Hopefully everyone stays healthy, and we'll talk soon. Thanks.